Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to do a video talking about the anniversary for War Thunder. If you didn't know, War Thunder has its anniversary on the 1st of November. This usually means that we have an event around the 1st of November and also have a bunch of sales too. So if you're thinking about purchasing anything right now, unless it's a specific special offer, I wouldn't worry about it. Just give it about a month or a little bit more and you'll be able to get it half price, which is fantastic. Now, the thing about the anniversary event is usually it brings along a pretty cool vehicle, some kind of Second World War banger. Recently, we've had the TOG II, we've had stuff like the Sturm Tiger, which has been fantastic. All really iconic and interesting vehicles. So I thought in this video, what we would do is we would have a look at some vehicles which are slightly out of the norm, which I think would be fun as anniversary vehicles. These vehicles don't always have to be that useful in battle, but are iconic in the way that they celebrate something that is a bit weird and quirky. Another thing to also mention, my father is visiting from England and I haven't seen him in quite a long time. So this week, if you're trying to contact me or if you watch the streams, they're going to be a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but we'll get there and we'll be back to normal standards next week. As always, if you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. The first vehicle is the T7. This is a project that came out from America in the middle of the Second World War. The idea of it was pretty simple. They felt like stuff like the M3 and the M5 Stuart needed a replacement, so therefore they were going to build this vehicle in order to replace them. The T7 project had a bunch of different variants to it since they were prototyping a bunch of different stuff, and technically they did produce a few of them in the form of the M7. They only produced actually 7 of them, so not exactly huge numbers. The major issue with the T7 or the M7, depending on which one you're looking at, is the fact that it didn't really fill the role it was supposed to replace. In January of 1941, they put out a bunch of design requirements about a new light tank. One of these requirements was that it was supposed to be around 14 tons. Now, when the T7 was built, the actual tonnage of this vehicle was 27 to 28 tons, so the requirement was changed to fit it, and this basically meant that it wasn't really a light tank. It was just a big old, very heavy light tank, basically more classified as a medium tank. And the problem with that was the Americans already had the Sherman, which was slightly heavier than the T7, but it basically had the same firepower in the form of the 75mm M3 gun. The mobility of the Sherman was slightly less than the M7 or the T7, so there wasn't really a point in the vehicle. It also had worse armor, with about 10mm of armor being worse on it. So instead of actually replacing the light tanks which were around, this vehicle became kind of like a middle ground between the Sherman and the light tanks they had. So it was kind of worthless. Now, with the M7 or the T7, there is a bunch of variants, so you could actually bring it in different ways. Basically, there's the T7E2, which is quite fun, because that one had the 6-pounder gun on it, so you could technically have a different one. The E5 was the one which had access to either the M3 Lee's gun, the 75mm M3, which is also used on the Sherman. The fate, or the problem with this M7, though, at the end of the day, was it didn't fit what it was supposed to do, and also America just made a better vehicle in the form of the M24 Chaffee. The next vehicle is the Stug IV. This one was in the actual initial release tree for Germany in terms of what would come to the game. And it's been about 10 years, so it would make sense to bring it out on an anniversary to kind of mark that idea. The fact that this vehicle has just not made it yet. The Stug IV was an assault gun, an SPG, and could also be used in other areas, and the reason why it came about is basically because the success of the Stug III, but also because the Stug III was struggling in terms of its production. The Stug IV is one of those vehicles where they made over 10,000 of them during the war, and it was incredibly successful for the Germans. The problem with it, though, was by the middle of the war, air superiority for the Allied forces was starting to take over, and bombing raids had begun. And a lot of the factories where stuff like the Stug IIIs were being produced were just getting bombed to all hell. So what they decided to do was the factories that were producing Panzer IVs would also be converted to create Stug IVs, since the Stug idea was more efficient, and also they'd seen great success with the Stug III. Now, in the end of the war, so basically from the end of 1943 to April 1945, they'd built over 1,000 of these things, which is pretty impressive. But also, it was using pre-existing, stuff. They used the Stug III superstructure, they used the Panzer IV chassis, and just married them together with the 75mm Stug 40 L48 gun. And it was very successful. When it comes to the war, I feel like a lot of people focus on stuff like the Tiger, the Panther, these heavy vehicles that Germany kind of brought out. But if you actually look at the most successful or most produced vehicles, it's the Panzer IV, it's the Panzer III, and the Stug IV, and the Stug III. They were very much on a winning idea when it came to these vehicles, and the fact that they could fill multiple roles while also keeping the crew secure, which was a huge benefit to vehicles like this. Since we have the Staghound, the Boarhound, and also the Greyhound, it's only worth actually talking about their missing brother, the Wolfhound, the M38. This was a six-wheeled armored car, which was produced in 1944. It's very similar to the other concepts, the idea of mobility being something which would really fly around the place. This vehicle was supposed to actually replace the Greyhound, but it just never ended up getting there. The cool thing about the Wolfhound, though, is the fact that they tried different turrets on it. Basically, they started off with a 37mm M6 turret with some 30 cals and 50 cals around the place, but there was actually a version of it which had a Chaffee turret, which looks absolutely hilarious. Unfortunately, with this vehicle, it never really went anywhere. There wasn't a bunch of them, it didn't get to production, basically. There was a few of them that they built from the prototype stage. It seemed to work, everything was good, but they decided to go in a different direction, probably because of the fact that it was a late Second World War vehicle, and if you know anything about America's history at the end of the Second World War, they ended up cancelling a ton of their projects, and basically going, okay, the war's over, let's reset, let's start a new way of life. Then, it does have a pretty good horsepower per ton, meaning that it can move around at a good click, nearly going 100 kilometers an hour, which would be pretty fun to play with. We have many versions of the T-34 in the game, so why not the T-43? The T-43 was a very weird prototype. Imagine that you are in the Soviet Union. Imagine that Operation Barbarossa has kicked off and the Germans are marching east. They also have this new kind of technology, a larger gun, the 75mm KWK-40, which is just tearing through your T-34 tanks. So, what would you do in that setup? Well, what the Soviets did is they kind of took what a T-34 was at the time, so the 76mm armed 1942 version, and decided, let's take that general idea and basically buff up its armor. So on the turret, for example, they increased it from 70mm to 90mm, and also on the hull, it now had 60mm of armor instead of 47 on the sides of it. The idea was to create a vehicle very similar to the T-34, but it had the armor to withstand the 75mm. They built it, they tested it and trialed it. It obviously had worse mobility than the standard T-34. The T-43 also had a different suspension type to try and help it out, and the coolest thing about it is it also had a three-man turret, which is something the T-34 didn't really have at that time. It also was powered by a 500 horsepower diesel. This gave it 15 horsepower per ton. And the problem with its trial is when they trialed the vehicle, it still retained the same gun. So the 76mm F34, which was found ineffective against a lot of the heavier German vehicles. So even though it could stop a 75mm shell coming in from the German vehicles, what it couldn't stop at the time, in 1943 when it was tested, was the 88mm, which had also turned up. So what the Soviet designers realized is, instead of just trying to build a vehicle which had more and more armor, how about we fight back? And so what they did instead is took the standard T-34, which was of course in production in massive numbers, redesigned the turret so it could fit an 85mm, therefore it could penetrate the German tanks too. So fight fire with fire, instead of just continuously taking damage. This basically meant that the T-43, as a prototype, was kind of dead in the water. But at the same time, it is a pretty cool vehicle, was fully tested, was fully built. I don't know why we don't have this in the game already. And of course, the vehicle that we have to talk about, which I'm amazed hasn't made it in the game, at least as a decoration, the Bob Semple tank. This was one of the vehicles that the New Zealanders actually made. Surprisingly, they actually made a kind of useful vehicle, the Schofield, which I'm sure we could actually get in the game, but the Bob Semple is the one that always gets all the media attention because it's so ridiculous. It is basically a box made out of corrugated iron based on a tractor base, which then was kind of like a mobile pillbox, something that is very reminiscent to some of the early designs for tanks from the First World War. But this vehicle was not made in the First World War, it was made very much after it, and that's kind of what makes it very interesting. The fact that you have so many different countries working on so many different ideas at different times makes the evolution of military history the most interesting. And this Bob Semple tank was technically a Second World War vehicle. Now, the vehicle itself only has 6 303 Bren-Light machine guns. There was an idea or a variant to add a turret with a 37mm on it, but it never really did anything and wasn't built. So instead, I would actually say this should be a hangar piece. The vehicle is just sat in a very interesting part of history, and hopefully at some point it can get added into the game in at least some form or another. Not just for the representation of the New Zealanders, but also because it is actually interesting in its design and how it's set up. The vehicle itself could surprisingly go 24 kilometers an hour, it had a 127 horsepower engine, but also weighed 25 tons. A pretty chunky boy. As always though, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem, Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.